Hello and welcome back to the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Thanks for tuning in with us. This week, Jayden and I are going to be discussing monkeypox.
Yeah, we thought this might be kind of an interesting disease to cover. So what exactly is monkeypox and how would you go about catching it?
So yeah, monkeypox is kind of interesting, and it's something which, I have to be right up front about it. It's not something I've had tons of experience with, dealing with, either reading cases about it or even, talking about vaccines and stuff. But it is something which is making the news every now and then, and I think it's something which is worth at least discussing. And kind of when you're looking for topics, you always want to try and find something a little bit different. So anyway, monkeypox, it is a disease that a human would get from encountering an animal, typically speaking, an infected animal, usually through either, bodily fluids or like broken skin, the respiratory tract, or nose, mouth, eyes, that sort of thing. And it also can be caught by consuming an infected animal. So by eating an infected animal, you could potentially get monkeypox. It is very similar in some ways to smallpox from a family of virus perspective. There's definitely a lot of similarity there. And as far as some historical stuff, and again, Jayden, thank you for doing the advanced research, because I didn't know this until you had pointed it out. It was discovered in 1958 in monkeys, which I guess maybe is where the monkey from monkeypox comes from. But the first human case was in 1970 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are two sort of different groupings. I believe they refer to them as clades, which I don't even really know what, like the exact what clades, where that comes from. But anyway, the Central African version, which seems to be the more dangerous one, and then a Western African version. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at for sort of the basics on monkeypox.
Yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what the word clades meant either. I figured that was something along the lines of like the term variant or something like that. But
yeah, I think it sort of is. But why you call it that as opposed to something else, I don't have an awesome answer for you.
No, me neither. Okay, well, you mentioned the Democratic Republic of Congo, but where is the virus most commonly found, and where should travelers be concerned about potentially acquiring it?
I think the majority of cases have been there in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's where, there have been cases and deaths. I believe, again, more of your awesome research here. In 2019, there were 5,000 cases and over 100 deaths. But it certainly is also a thing in other tropical rainforest areas throughout West Africa as well. So as far as listing countries, like, here's the list that you had found. And I think, these are all sort of within a contiguous area, but countries like, Sierra Leone and Republic of Congo and Liberia, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Cameroon, these parts of the world. And it does seem like there are more human cases lately. Like it seems like we are starting to see more of this. And I guess, we have run into some other outbreaks. So, there was an outbreak in Nigeria in 2017. It probably is all related with this whole general concept of, humans and, encroaching into, deforesting areas and just our increasing contact between humans and wilder, junglier areas.
Right. So if you do happen to contract monkeypox due to one reason or another, what would the symptoms appear to be?
So the incubation period falls sort of in that 1 to 2 week category. And a lot of people will never have symptoms. They'll just never know they had it. But if you are unfortunate enough to have symptoms, you're looking at things like, fever, chill, feelings lousy and headaches, muscle pain, lymph nodes swelling up. Then after that, there can be like a blistering on the skin, which can go throughout the body. Sometimes it'll start on the face, but it can go everywhere, and including inside your mouth and basically all over. And a lot of severe cases are in younger kids, and you can have other complications too. Things like other gastrointestinal eye problems, respiratory problems, pneumonias, even in something like an encephalitis where swelling of the brain. But so there's a lot of potential things that could happen bad, negative
Yes.
things.
Definitely. It definitely seemed like the type of thing where the complications seemed pretty bad, especially when it got into your eyes.
Yes, I don't know. I'm always squeamish about anything involving the eyes, so that's why we should probably never do any topics that is what do you call it? Loa, I believe. There, Jayden. This is something we didn't plan for. Look that up. There's a couple of very eye specific diseases that I don't even want to think about, but there's a couple of them I don't want to discuss on the podcast.
Hey, well, I'm pretty squeamish about my eyes too. There's a reason why I wear glasses and not contacts.
Yeah,
I'll
there
say
you
that.
go. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you were to unfortunately develop monkeypox, is there any treatment or is it mainly sort of patient comfort, fluids, that type of thing?
Mostly symptomatic treatment. I think that dehydration, you can rehydrate, but it's mostly symptomatic treatment. There has been some research on an immune globulin, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet as being anything that is like a standard of care or anything like that. And I know, Jayden, you had uncovered some research on using some antivirals. Since this is a virus, now that we've been sort of living in this COVID world here where we're trying all these different antivirals, there is some research where they're trying to use some antivirals to treat, and maybe in severe cases, in certain situations, this could potentially be something. I think the biggest concern there is that this is, first of all, early stages of research, but second of all, the kinds of patient populations that are getting monkeypox are probably not really in places where some of these antivirals would be readily available. So that would be a real concern, in an outbreak and that sort of thing. But it's on the horizon. It's something that is definitely being researched at this point in time.
Definitely, yeah. It's unfortunate that can be quite severe, and it's common in areas where the health infrastructure is pretty fragile, I guess you could say. So I hope that research continues and there can be kind of some progress in that department.
Yeah, definitely. This I think is not been an illness which I would really define as like a real traveler's illness. This is much more of an illness that is more of a locally acquired and people that are more living in the areas, as opposed to somebody who's going into a place, for a relatively short period of time on a more typical tourist itinerary. Although that being said, I think that, if I was to sort of identify the type of traveler that might be more at risk at this, would be a traveler that is, say, going back to visit family. You're from this part of the world, you're going back to go visit family, you're going to stay for like a month, you're going to be like staying with family, eating very locally, and then that's when you start getting into some of the stuff with eating quote unquote traditional foods, and where your chances of exposure increase.
Right. And that would be kind of like the type of person that you would be sort of most concerned about in terms of risk factors, you would say.
Yeah, like you start talking about if somebody was going to one of the countries we listed above, and they were going for like a week or 2 weeks, they're going for like a business trip or that sort of thing. I think your chances of running into monkeypox would be pretty low in a major center where you're not really deviating too far from your typical things that you would do, say, on a business trip or even on like a tourist itinerary. But it would be more people going into sort of the more remote, the more further out areas. I guess another risk population could be like volunteer missionary type people that are going to be in an area, more remote areas for extended periods of time. That would be another group which might be a little bit more at risk.
Right. So there is also a vaccine for monkeypox specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is sort of like the process of that, and I assume it would be in the kind of risk groups that we just assessed, but who would be sort of eligible to receive it or would be recommended to get it before traveling?
Well, at this point, if you, from a Canadian perspective, I don't think I can't order any into Polaris. It's not something I can order in at this point. Now, is that going to change in the future? I'm not very clear on that. I think it might be something coming down the road that we may see. A little bit about this vaccine. It's a 2-dose vaccine. It's a live vaccine, and it does seem to have effects that go beyond just monkeypox. There's protection against smallpox. There's protection against cowpox, we think, although we don't really have to worry about smallpox at this point in time, thankfully. The vaccine really exists more in government hands and regulatory, those type of organizations. It's not really been disseminated out to private sources. Like I said, as far as I know, and actually I probably should have done, I did not, you're great at doing all the research, Jayden, in advance, and I totally appreciate it. But one thing I probably should have done and before we did this podcast is find out how someone within Canada could access this vaccine. But right now, I'm not aware of any way. I do know that, like I said, I can't just call up one of our typical suppliers or wholesalers and say, hey, send me over a few doses of that. That's not possible at this point in time. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
So would it be available through, I assume from what I understand, it's been approved by Health Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to receive it, say, through AHS or some other provincial? I just am not sure of the, if it's approved, what the distribution method is, if it's not sort of commercially available through pharmacies, as you said.
Well, I guess right now I would expect that public health, like in Alberta, AHS, like you're mentioning, whether they have the ability to get it, they might have the ability to get it, but I don't really know what criteria would be in place that they would be able to actually get it. Here in Alberta, AHS has been trying to get out of sort of doing travel consultations, pre-travel consultations. They were doing a fair bit of that sort of thing, especially in some smaller centers pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, they've kind of really gone away from doing that. The resources have been dedicated elsewhere. But right. I'm not really aware of a situation where you could contact AHS and say, I'm going to a monkeypox area and I'd like to get vaccinated. Can you make that happen for me? I don't know. I think probably if you were going to those areas and you were part of a volunteer group, an aid agency, maybe they could have some connections to government sources where maybe that might be possible. But that's kind of more speculation on my part. I, as far as if I was somebody who was a traveler going there to go visit my family for a month, I don't know of any practical way that person could realistically acquire that vaccine in Canada at this point in time, at least.
Right. And it's sort of been indicated when I was doing the research that it's been mainly stockpiled and sort of the supply is controlled to some extent by various governments, I assume, sort of in the most, I don't want to say endemic regions, but where it's sort of more common.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is if you want to take a dark, unexpected turn, Jayden, here in the podcast off script, I think one thing too is when you start thinking about smallpox, one of the other things is that, we don't really have any natural immunity to smallpox anymore. It's been eradicated and not part of the background for many years. I'm 50 and I was not vaccinated against smallpox. So no one younger than me was vaccinated against smallpox, and people older than me were. But, there's always the concern about, the possibility that something like that could be turned into a biological weapon. And yes. So you could always make an argument that if this vaccine has effectiveness against smallpox, well, that might be something that the government might want to have in their back pocket in a stockpile somewhere, just in case a very awful things could end up happening. And yeah, for that matter, right now, my understanding, and I'm not certain about this, but my understanding is I believe that some Canadian Armed Forces people are still being vaccinated for smallpox, depending on situations and stuff. So for all I know, it could be this vaccine. I don't really know that, but I know there's also a smallpox specific vaccine, but that would be one of the reasons why it may be in, for example, Health Canada's interest to, have a fridge of this stuff sitting someplace in Ottawa.
Right. Well, the other vaccine, is that something that the one that is mainly for smallpox, but I believe it is sort of like a broad protective one for these types of in this like sort of disease group. Is that something that's available to you more so like commercially?
No, that one, as I understand it, is very clear cut. It's only for government use only. There's
Right.
there's no ability to get that. Like the only way that can be acquired is through Health Canada. And I've never heard of anybody else except Armed Forces people getting it. Because the only real context right now for smallpox is biological warfare, right? There's
Right.
there are no cases out there. Like there are no naturally occurring smallpox cases. There hasn't been for decades. The only way we're going to see, I guess maybe workers that work with smallpox in a lab, maybe they might be as well. But the only way we're ever going to see a smallpox outbreak is if there's some kind of horrible lab problem or as a weapon.
Right. There is a bit of a side note. There is a very interesting book about smallpox being used as a weapon. I think it's called I Am Pilgrim. It's a great little book. It's sort of like a true crime undercover spy type of guy who discovers this plot basically to destroy the West with this new like smallpox.
Oh yeah.
Variant.
Like I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, that is an area that is really ripe for storytelling and stuff. And, we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about smallpox and about the whole eradication of smallpox. That would actually be a good thing to find somebody who could speak more to the history of it. But yeah, there's a lot of fascinating stuff there about, and I guess one of the things, and again, we've gone way off monkeypox now, but, one of the points that I think is really interesting is that, like, smallpox was eradicated in the 70s at the height of the Cold War. At that
Right.
point in time, the West and the communist bloc didn't agree on anything, but they did agree on eradicating smallpox, which is really remarkable, especially when you look at the world now. Like I would have a hard time imagining that we could have that kind of collaborative effort in this day and age. But yeah, that was something that, the scientists were all on the same page and agreed. And that never would have happened if there was the types of sort of stuff we see right now, sort of, and when you look at COVID and with China and everything like that. But again, we're going down a whole different path there, Jayden. Now that's more your political science area. And I could probably talk about that all day too, even though I'm not as well versed in it as you are. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm big fan of the Cold War. So
yeah, well, that might be something we might have to think about one day when we start, sometimes I think we are, there's only so many diseases you can do, and maybe there are other vaccine and travel health related things we should talk about. So maybe the history of that could be a sort of a potential topic at some point down the line.
Definitely. I would be interested in doing that. But one thing I might ask you back to the monkeypox vaccine itself.
Is that what this is about again? Oh, I forgot.
Oh yes. It is a live vaccine. What does it mean for it to be a non-replicating vaccine? I saw that when I was sort of doing the research about it, and it said that it was a live, attenuated, non-replicating vaccine, but I wasn't familiar what exactly a non-replicating vaccine is supposed to mean.
You got me. I don't actually know. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. To me, like what I would take from that is it's alive, but it's been weakened. Attenuated means weakened. So
Right.
That means that you have basically stomped all over it and made it very weak but then weak to the point where it can't multiply in any way. It can't grow. So to me, that's typically how live vaccines typically are. So I don't know, actually. So I think, to me, I don't know how that makes it different from, say, yellow fever, because yellow
Right.
fever is a live attenuated vaccine. I presume it's non-replicating as well. I don't know. Like that's
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I've done a bit of research on the vaccines, and I never had seen that description before. And I was like, oh, that's odd. I mean, I would assume that most of them would be non-replicating. Maybe that's just self-explanatory, and we're overthinking it. But
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And I think, but anyway, it is interesting. And one of the things that's going to be happening is we're going to be seeing a lot of new vaccines over the next little while, I think. And this is probably one which I can't imagine will be anything from a Canadian standpoint much more than a niche product. But yeah, there's certainly some new technologies and old technologies. When you start looking at some of the vaccines being produced, some of them are currently even the newer products are being made with very new technology like the mRNA, but then there's also some that are being made with very old school technology like this new Novavax COVID vaccine. It's like the 1980s type vaccine technology, right? And very old school. So like we're going to continue to see products developed in both very innovative new ways and also very traditional ways as well.
Right. Yeah. I think that's interesting because I think from what I understand, we've been moving away from the live style of vaccines more towards non-live
Absolutely.
vaccines, so to speak.
They're so much more fraught with difficulty, right? In the sense of who can get them and who can't get them, and even the production of them. When you start thinking about creating some of these live vaccines, like something like a yellow fever, for example, it takes a long time to make it. It's complicated. And the technology they use to make yellow fever vaccine is very, very old school, but it takes like a very long period of time for that virus to be grown in a chicken egg and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of reasons to not have a live vaccine from that standpoint. But that being said, sometimes that's where the more likely things come up. Again, getting off the topic, but one of the real prime vaccines that we're looking at for a couple of these other things, I think like even like with dengue, they're looking at it, could be a live vaccine. So, I think they're always going to approach it from, what works and what doesn't work. And the trend is definitely more towards non-live vaccines for, like I said, for patient reasons and also just even for supply or manufacturing reasons. Like that's one thing about these mRNA vaccines. They're very easy to make. Like once assuming you have the research, the specialized equipment and everything else, the actual making of the vaccine is actually not difficult and fast.
Right. So this particular vaccine, I believe it's Jynneos, or however you might. It's got a different name in Canada. Yeah. It's called Imvamune in Canada, but it apparently is safe for everybody, including people who are immunocompromised or who are organ transplant recipients, and even for people who are above a certain age who are generally otherwise not recommended to get live vaccines. How exactly? I mean, I know that you obviously are not, it's not like you're giving this vaccine out all the time, but how would that be the case? How does that happen?
Well, I think, that might have something to do with this whole non-replicating aspect of things, because it's just, it seems like a very counterintuitive thing to me. Like I don't fully understand exactly where that comes from and where, what the thought process is there. So my short answer is that is a real inconsistency. The one thing that we see with live vaccines that usually if you're immunocompromised, you can't get it. So what makes this one special? I'm not completely sure.
Yeah, because I know even with the live flu vaccine, you can't even hang out with people who are immunocompromised after having that. And that's just for the flu.
Yeah, and that's part of the fact that because it's nasal, you could be expelling live flu particles out of your nose by just breathing out. Right. So that, if we get this question actually surprisingly at the clinic more often than you'd think. Someone's getting a measles, mumps, rubella shot, and they'll ask like, am I infectious? Like if I'm around somebody who's unvaccinated, can I give them measles? And the answer is no. Like that vaccine is inside you. There's no way that you can potentially, pass it on. Of course, like there are, for anything that's an injectable type vaccine that's live, that's not possible. It's only when you start talking about oral vaccines, in theory, again, this could be a whole different rabbit hole, but polio, in fact, we might have even talked about this on the previous podcast about polio, the oral live polio vaccine, which is still given out in a lot of places in the world, but not Canada. You can be infected with polio by being exposed to feces of a person who's been recently vaccinated with oral polio vaccine.
Really?
Yes. And we still see some of those cases in developing countries right now. In fact, there was even maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a situation in Ukraine where that happened. There were a couple cases of polio acquired. I think it was a situation where babies were given the oral vaccine, and then it was involving diaper changes or whatever by people who were susceptible.
Wow.
Yeah. This is we could not be having more tangents on this one. Eh? I think this is to everyone out there listening. I think we both agree that this topic of monkeypox might be a little short and sweet, but I think this is not going to turn into one of our shorter podcasts, although we've been all over the map on this one, which is it's kind of fun, but it's all over the map.
Yeah, well, it's opened a bit of a can of worms about the whole live versus non-live vaccine. I was under the impression that with polio that we had basically eradicated it largely from pretty much everywhere except for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that was the only place where wild polio was still left over. And up until Nigeria got rid of it a couple of years ago.
Well, you're good on you. That's exactly where you're at. But when you actually hit the point there perfectly, wild polio, that's polio. The definition of sort of wild polio is a polio acquired in the community. Vaccine-derived polio would not be considered wild polio. So when you see some of these cases, and there have been cases like this, like they're not super rare. Like it probably happens a couple times a year that we'll get a report of vaccine-derived polio. Like the one, I don't know why that Ukraine one sort of sticks in my head, but there was also been a couple of those situations in Africa not that long ago. But anywhere that uses live polio oral, there's a risk. Now, the chances of there being like an outbreak are virtually none, mostly because most people are vaccinated, but it really, everything has to exactly go wrong for someone to get vaccine derived polio, but it does happen every now and then.
Because I can recall that you actually gave me a copy of every vaccine that I'd had from my medical records, and I don't believe that I've been vaccinated for polio. I don't think that
you have for sure. It's
really?
Yeah. What they were doing. So if you're an old guy like me, we got the oral polio vaccine, but from somebody who would be probably under 30 years of age, at your 2-month, your 4-month, your 6-month shots, they would give you the tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, polio combination vaccines. So if you pull up your vaccine record and you see something on there, like a whole long list of string of letters, and it would be like DTAP hyphen IPV. IPV is injected polio vaccine. Injectable polio vaccine. So
interesting.
So yeah, you were, and you didn't really even know it because it's been part of the vaccine schedule. It's still part of the vaccine schedule. And sometimes we'll even have people who maybe are a bit vaccine hesitant, they're the parents, and they're like, why are we vaccinating against polio still? Well, it's been in that combination vaccine forever. And I would like to think that we're at some point in the future, we won't have to do it anymore. But as long as there's any cases out there, we're going to keep doing it. But polio is like smallpox in the sense that there's only human transmission, right? So there's no animal, like insect or mammal vector. So it is an illness that we could completely eradicate like smallpox. It's just we have to have the political will to get everybody vaccinated.
Right. So that is different than monkeypox, which would have an animal reservoir, so to speak.
Absolutely.
It's something like cowpox.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to completely eliminate those because we can't go into the jungle and vaccinate every animal.
Is there an animal vaccine?
I don't actually know. I would tend to think it's not. I'm not something that I'm aware of. I don't think it's something that your typical, small animal in North America would get. But
right.
Is it potentially a veterinary vaccine or something like that? Perhaps.
Right. Because that's with like the rabies thing. We go and try and vaccinate some animals every once in a while to try and push down the animal cases.
Yeah. Well,
perhaps we could vaccinate some of the monkeys.
Well, that would be fun, right? Go into the jungle and try and vaccinate a bunch of monkeys.
That might be a recipe just for getting monkeypox in the first place.
I think I would volunteer for. I think I'd volunteer for like a safer duty, like giving vaccines in a war zone or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know how compliant the patients would be in that situation.
Yeah, not very.
Not very. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to mention about monkeypox or about anything
else? Well, I don't know. I think
we've of the other 10 things that we talked about.
Yeah, I think we've gone all over the map on this one, and it's been kind of fun, and hopefully that our sort of divergence from the original topic hasn't chased too many people away. But anyway, I think that's really all I've got for now.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. A reminder that the information and advice provided in this podcast are not a substitute for live medical advice tailored to your itinerary and your personal medical history. If you have questions or you'd like to book an appointment, please head over to our website, www.polaristravelclinic.ca. Check us out on Twitter @PolarisTravelRx and our Facebook page as well. We hope you'll tune in again with us next week.
Thanks, Jayden.
Thank you.